Mom, you're back already? My son said, standing in the middle of my living room as if he'd been caught borrowing something small instead of rearranging my entire life. I had just been discharged that morning after 3 weeks in St. Matthew's Medical Center recovering from a complicated hip surgery, and the nurse who wheeled me to the curb had wished me luck, telling me how good it would feel to sleep in my own bed again. I believed her. I believed I was coming home to the quiet elegance of my 2-bedroom suite on the 12th floor, the one my late husband Harold and I had chosen for its wide windows overlooking the Hudson River and the soft gray carpets that muffled every footstep. Instead, when I pressed my key into the lock and pushed the door open, I heard the shrill laughter of my granddaughter echoing down the hallway and the deep rumble of a television tuned to a sports channel Harold used to watch every Sunday. There were sneakers by the console table where I kept fresh lilies. A stroller leaned against the wall beneath the framed photograph of Harold in his navy blazer. The air smelled different, not like my lavender diffuser, but like someone else's detergent and the faint sweetness of children's cereal. Daniel stepped toward me with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, his hand hovering near my wheelchair as if he suddenly remembered I might still be fragile. We thought it made sense, he added quickly, glancing over his shoulder toward the kitchen where Ashley was opening and closing cabinet doors. I let my gaze travel slowly across the room. My cream-colored throw pillows were gone, replaced by bright patterned ones I didn't recognize. The armchair where I read every evening had been shifted closer to the window, and in its place stood a bulky recliner that looked like it had never belonged to this space. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't ask why my family was unpacking boxes in the home I had paid off 5 years ago. Instead, I said, very calmly, "Did you at least change the sheets?" Ashley appeared in the hallway then, her blonde hair pulled into a neat ponytail, her expression carefully arranged into concern. "Margaret, we just want to help," she said, as if the word help could stretch wide enough to cover. Suitcases stacked beside my dining table and Daniel's briefcase resting on my desk. I noticed my desk because the drawer where I kept my checkbook was slightly open. A small detail. Easy to miss. I have always believed that the smallest details tell the loudest stories. 3 days before my surgery, I had handed Ashley the spare key in case of emergencies. I remembered the way she had smiled, the way she had squeezed my hand and said, "Don't worry about a thing." I had assumed she meant meals, mail, maybe watering the peace lilies. I had not imagined she meant moving her entire household into my suite while I was under anesthesia. I felt the weight of the hospital bracelet still circling my wrist, a reminder that only hours ago I had been measured in blood pressure readings and pain scales. Now I was being measured in square footage. My granddaughter ran past me, dragging a stuffed bear across my rug, and called out, "Daddy, is this my room now?" I looked down the hallway toward my bedroom. The door was open. Through the gap, I could see a pink comforter folded at the foot of my bed. Pink was never my color. I inhaled slowly, counting to 5 the way the physical therapist had taught me when the pain flared. Inhale. Hold. Exhale. They thought I was coming home weak. They thought 3 weeks in a hospital bed had turned me into someone who needed decisions made for her. I offered Daniel a thin smile. "I suppose," I said softly, "we have a lot to discuss." I remained near the doorway longer than necessary, allowing the room to reveal itself to me inch by inch, as if I were a guest rather than the woman whose name was printed on the deed. Daniel cleared his throat and began explaining something about their lease ending unexpectedly, about how the landlord had decided to renovate, about how it would only be for a short while, but his words floated past me like distant radio static. I watched Ashley instead. She moved confidently through my kitchen, opening drawers without hesitation, stacking plastic cups beside my crystal glasses, placing a bright blue cereal box on the counter where I once arranged fresh fruit in a porcelain bowl Harold brought back from Charleston. It was not the presence of my family that unsettled me. It was the ease with which they occupied my space. Daniel finally stepped closer and crouched slightly so he could look me in the eye. "Mom, you should not be alone after surgery," he said gently. "The doctor said you need help for at least 6 weeks." I nodded slowly. The doctor had indeed recommended limited movement and physical therapy 3 times a week. He had not recommended surrendering ownership of my home. "Help," I repeated quietly, tasting the word as if it were unfamiliar. Ashley appeared beside him, folding her arms in a gesture she probably believed looked supportive. "We moved the master bedroom closer to the bathroom for you," she said, pointing down the hall. "It is safer." I did not correct her. The master bedroom had always been safer. It had been mine for 15 years. Instead, I asked, "Where are my things?" Ashley hesitated just long enough for me to notice. "We put most of your clothes in the second closet," she answered. It just made more sense with the kids. Made more sense. That phrase again. I glanced toward my desk once more. The drawer was still slightly open. I memorized that detail the way I used to memorize grocery lists when Daniel was small and we could not afford to forget anything. I remembered another afternoon, 3 weeks earlier, when Daniel had visited me at the hospital with a folder tucked under his arm. He had said it contained insurance documents that required my signature. I had been groggy from medication, trusting as only a mother can be when her son stands beside her bed. I signed where he pointed. Now, standing in my own living room, I wondered what else had been in that folder. My granddaughter tugged at Ashley's hand and asked if she could paint her nails at the kitchen table. Ashley laughed softly and said yes, reminding her to lay down paper first. I listened to the domestic rhythm forming around me, the clink of dishes, the hum of the refrigerator, the murmur of a sports commentator drifting from the television. This was the soundtrack of a household settling in, not a family visiting temporarily. Daniel rose to his full height and placed his hand on the back of my wheelchair. "Let us get you comfortable, Mom," he said. "You need to rest." I looked up at him and saw not the boy who once scraped his knees on the playground and cried for me, but a man calculating square footage and convenience. I allowed him to wheel me down the hallway. When we reached my bedroom, I saw that the pink comforter was neatly spread across the mattress and my framed photograph of Harold had been moved from the nightstand to the dresser, partially obscured by a stack of children's books. I felt something shift inside me then, not anger, not yet, but clarity. They believed this arrangement was practical. They believed I would accept it because I had always accepted what was easiest for them. As Daniel helped me transfer carefully from the wheelchair to the edge of the bed, I placed my hand over his and said in a steady voice, "Thank you for looking after things while I was away." He smiled with visible relief, mistaking composure for surrender. I leaned back against the pillows and listened as their voices drifted down the hallway, already planning dinner, already discussing where to place a bookshelf. I closed my eyes, not to sleep, but to think. I had survived surgery. I had managed the estate after Harold passed. I had balanced investments and property taxes and medical bills without assistance. If my family believed I could not manage my own home, they were about to discover how little they understood me. That night I did not sleep much, although I kept my eyes closed and my breathing slow whenever footsteps passed my door. I listened to the unfamiliar rhythm of my own home adjusting to different habits, the television clicking off later than I preferred, the dishwasher running past 10 o'clock, the soft patting of my granddaughter's feet in the hallway as Ashley reminded her in a hushed voice that Grandma needed her rest. The word grandma sounded gentle, almost affectionate, yet it echoed strangely against the walls that had once carried only Harold's laughter and my own quiet routines. Around midnight I heard Daniel's voice lower, serious, drifting from the living room. "We just need to make sure everything is organized," he said. Ashley responded in a tone that was practical rather than emotional. "It is better this way. She cannot manage alone anymore." I did not move. I let the sentence settle inside me. She cannot manage alone anymore. At 6:30 the next morning I woke before anyone else, as I always had when Daniel was a child and cereal bowls needed to be set out before school. The sunlight filtered through the curtains and landed across the pink comforter, turning it a softer shade, almost harmless. My hip ached when I shifted, but the pain was sharp and honest, nothing like the quiet rearranging that had taken place while I was under anesthesia. I reached for my phone on the nightstand and found it placed slightly farther away than I remembered. A small detail. I pulled it toward me and opened my banking application. The balance was there, steady and intact, but I noticed a recent inquiry request dated 2 days before my discharge. Someone had contacted the bank about account access. I closed the application without reacting. A mother learns long ago that reacting too quickly often reveals more than silence ever could. When I finally wheeled myself into the kitchen using the walker the hospital had insisted upon, Ashley looked surprised to see me upright so early. "Margaret, you should have called," she said brightly. "I was going to bring you breakfast." I smiled politely. "Old habits," I replied. "I have been waking up at dawn for over 40 years. Daniel poured himself coffee from my stainless steel pot and handed me a mug without asking how I took it. He used to remember that I preferred 1 teaspoon of sugar and a splash of milk. Today he handed it to me black. I accepted it anyway. I watched as Ashley opened my mail, sorting envelopes into 2 piles. "We are just trying to help keep things organized," she explained when she saw me looking. I nodded once. "Organization is important," I agreed. After breakfast, Daniel mentioned that he had spoken with a contractor about installing grab bars in the bathroom and possibly converting the second bedroom into a shared space for the children. "It will increase functionality," he said, using the tone he reserves for business meetings. Functionality. I wondered if he realized he was speaking about my home as though it were an investment property rather than the place where I had nursed his childhood fevers and celebrated his college acceptance. I asked casually, "How long do you expect this arrangement to last?" Daniel exchanged a quick glance with Ashley. "Until things stabilize," he answered. Stabilize. Another word that floated without an end date. I sipped my coffee slowly and allowed a thoughtful pause to stretch between us. "I see," I said. In that moment I understood something clearly. They had not come here because I was weak. They had come because they believed I was unaware. They believed paperwork signed in a hospital room and a spare key given in good faith were enough to shift control quietly. They believed that at 72 years old I would prefer comfort over confrontation. I placed my cup gently in the sink and turned toward Daniel with steady eyes. "Before any renovations begin," I said evenly, "there are a few documents I would like to review." His expression flickered, just for a second. It was a small flicker, but I saw it. And I knew then that this conversation was only the beginning. Daniel's expression steadied quickly, but I noticed the way his fingers tightened around the coffee mug before he set it down. "What documents?" he asked with a careful smile that felt rehearsed. I adjusted the walker slightly and positioned myself at the head of the dining table, the same seat I had occupied for every Thanksgiving since we moved into this suite. "The insurance forms I signed at the hospital," I replied calmly. "And anything else that required my signature while I was medicated." Ashley let out a soft laugh that was almost dismissive. "Margaret, it was just routine paperwork. The hospital always needs updated authorization in case of emergencies." I nodded slowly, studying her face. "Of course," I said. "Then it will not be difficult to review." Silence settled over the table for a few seconds, thick but controlled. Daniel finally spoke. "I will bring the folder tonight," he said. "It is in the car." "In the car. Not in a drawer. Not in a file cabinet. In the car." Another detail filed quietly away in my mind. I excused myself and returned to my bedroom, closing the door gently behind me. Once alone, I sat at the edge of the bed and allowed my thoughts to line up one by one. Harold had always insisted that clarity comes from stillness. I reached into the bottom drawer of my nightstand and removed a small leather notebook I had kept for years. Inside were the contact numbers for our attorney, Thomas Green, and our financial advisor, listed in Harold's careful handwriting. I had not needed to call either of them since Harold passed, but their names had always brought me comfort. I glanced at the clock. It was only 9:15 in the morning. Too early to appear alarmed. I decided to wait. The rest of the day unfolded with a strange domestic choreography. Ashley rearranged pantry shelves and labeled containers as if she were preparing for a long-term stay. Daniel took a work call from my balcony, pacing back and forth while discussing quarterly projections. I listened without appearing to listen. Every word he spoke was about expansion, consolidation, long-term positioning. The language of acquisition. In the afternoon, my granddaughter asked if she could hang drawings on the refrigerator. I told her she could use magnets instead of tape. She smiled brightly and hugged my waist, unaware of the quiet calculations happening around her. I felt no resentment toward the child. Children act on permission given by adults. By early evening, Daniel placed the folder on the dining table. "Here," he said, sliding it toward me. "You can look at everything." I opened it carefully, turning each page slowly. There were hospital consent forms, insurance authorizations, and one additional document that caught my attention. It was labeled Temporary Financial Oversight Agreement. My name was printed at the top. Daniel's name appeared beneath it as authorized co-manager. I read the date. It matched the day after my surgery. I did not react outwardly. I simply closed the folder and folded my hands over it. "Temporary," I repeated softly. Daniel nodded quickly. "Just in case bills needed to be paid while you were recovering." I met his eyes. "And how long does temporary last?" Ashley answered before he could. "Until you are fully stable." Stable. That word again, stretched without definition. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the steady ache in my hip, grounding me in the present. "I appreciate the concern," I said evenly. "However, I have managed this household for decades. I believe it is time to clarify a few misunderstandings." Daniel shifted in his seat. "Mom, we are just trying to make things easier." I offered him the same thin smile he had given me the day before. Ease, I replied quietly, depends on who is carrying the weight. I stood slowly with the walker and gathered the folder under my arm. I will review this thoroughly, I added. And tomorrow morning, I will be making a call. Neither of them asked to whom. But I noticed that neither of them smiled. I waited until the apartment grew quiet the next morning before making the call. Daniel had taken the children to school and Ashley was in the shower, the sound of running water masking the soft click of my bedroom door closing. I sat at my desk, the leather notebook open in front of me, and dialed Thomas Green's office number from memory before even glancing at the page. His assistant answered, her voice professional and steady, and when I gave my name there was a brief pause followed by warmth. Mrs. Whitmore, of course. Mr. Green will be very glad to hear from you. Within 15 minutes, Thomas himself was on the line. He sounded older than the last time we spoke, but still precise. Margaret, he said, how are you recovering? I told him I was healing well and then, without drama, explained the temporary financial oversight agreement I had discovered. I described the timing, the hospital room, the folder brought to me while I was medicated. I did not accuse. I did not speculate. I simply laid out the sequence of events as clearly as I could. There was a long silence on the other end before Thomas spoke again. Did you authorize permanent changes to ownership or deed structure? He asked. No, I answered. The suite remains solely in my name. He exhaled slowly. Then the agreement grants limited administrative access at best. It does not transfer control. However, we will need to review the exact language. I glanced toward the bedroom door, listening for movement in the hallway. I would like you to review it today, I said quietly. And I would prefer that my son does not know I have called. Thomas understood without further explanation. He suggested that I bring the document to his office or, if mobility was difficult, that he could visit me discreetly. I considered the layout of my own home now occupied by people who believed themselves secure. A visit would be best, I replied. This afternoon, if possible. After ending the call, I felt something settle inside me, not relief exactly, but direction. When Ashley emerged from the hallway, her hair wrapped in a towel, she smiled brightly as if nothing unusual had happened. Did you sleep better? She asked. Very well, I replied. Clarity helps. She did not ask what I meant. Around noon, I prepared tea at the kitchen counter while Ashley assembled sandwiches for the children. Daniel mentioned you wanted to review paperwork, she said lightly. It is really just a precaution. I stirred my tea slowly. Precautions are wise, I agreed. They protect everyone involved. At 1:30, the doorbell rang. Ashley looked surprised. Were you expecting someone? She asked. I met her gaze steadily. Yes, I said. Daniel returned shortly after, stopping abruptly when he saw Thomas Green seated at my dining table, the folder open in front of him. The air shifted instantly. Thomas stood and extended his hand politely. Daniel, he said in an even tone. I understand you assisted your mother while she was hospitalized. Daniel forced a smile and shook his hand. Ashley hovered near the kitchen entrance, her posture suddenly less relaxed. I remained seated at the head of the table, hands folded calmly in my lap. Thomas adjusted his glasses and began reading portions of the document aloud, his voice measured and deliberate. Certain phrases stood out clearly: temporary administrative support, revocable at any time by primary owner, no alteration of property rights without notarized consent. Each word felt like a small beam of light cutting through assumption. Daniel shifted in his chair. "It was only meant to help," he repeated. Thomas nodded. "Of course," he replied. "An assistance is commendable. However, Mrs. Whitmore retains full authority. Any continuation of this arrangement requires her explicit reaffirmation." Silence followed. I looked at my son, really looked at him, and saw uncertainty where confidence had been. "I appreciate your concern," I said evenly. "But I will be managing my own affairs moving forward." No one argued. No one raised a voice. The only sound in the room was the soft rustle of paper as Thomas closed the folder and slid it back toward me. In that quiet moment, I understood something essential. They had not expected resistance. They had expected gratitude. And now, for the first time since I returned home, the balance had shifted. After Thomas Green left that afternoon, the suite felt quieter than it had since my return, but it was not the comfortable quiet I once knew. It was the quiet of recalculation. Daniel stood by the window with his arms folded, staring down at the Hudson River as if the water might offer him a strategy. Ashley began clearing cups from the table with more force than necessary, though she said nothing. I remained seated at the head of the dining table, my back straight despite the steady ache in my hip. "There was no need to involve an attorney," Daniel said finally, his voice controlled but tight. I looked at him evenly. "There was every need," I replied. "When documents are signed in hospital rooms, clarity is not optional." He turned toward me. "We were trying to protect you." The sentence lingered in the air. Protect. I considered how often that word is used when control is the true objective. "Protection," I said calmly, "does not require secrecy." Ashley paused near the sink. "No one was hiding anything," she insisted. "We assumed you would want help." I nodded once. "Assumptions are powerful things," I answered. "They can rearrange a household without anyone raising their voice." Daniel's shoulders dropped slightly, as if he realized that volume would not win this conversation. "What do you want us to do?" he asked. The question was practical, but it carried something else beneath it. Concern, perhaps. Or inconvenience. I rose carefully with my walker and moved toward the living room. The pink comforter still lay across my bed down the hall, the labeled containers still lined my pantry shelves. Their presence was no longer invisible to me. "For now," I said, "I want space to recover without decisions being made on my behalf." Ashley set a dish down more sharply than before. "We gave up our lease," she said quietly. "We cannot just leave overnight." I turned to face her fully. "And yet you moved in overnight," I replied, my tone steady and even. Silence settled again, heavier this time. My granddaughter's laughter drifted faintly from the second bedroom where she was coloring. The innocence of that sound reminded me that this was not a battle to be fought loudly. It was a boundary to be drawn clearly. "I am not asking you to leave this minute," I continued. "But we will establish a timeline that respects my ownership and my autonomy." Daniel ran a hand through his hair. "How long?" he asked. I met his eyes without hesitation. 30 days, I said. "That gives you time to secure a new arrangement." Ashley inhaled sharply, but she did not argue. 30 days is a reasonable number. It is long enough to plan and short enough to signal that permanence was never granted. Daniel nodded slowly. All right, he said. 30 days. The agreement hung between us, fragile but binding. I returned to my chair and picked up the folder Thomas had reviewed. I felt no triumph, only steadiness. They had entered my home believing that age meant vulnerability, that recovery meant incapacity, that gratitude would override caution. What they were learning instead was that experience has its own strength. Later that evening, after dinner was prepared and dishes were washed, I wheeled myself onto the balcony alone. The river moved steadily beneath the fading light, unchanged by the conversations inside my walls. I rested my hands on the cool metal railing and allowed myself a single quiet thought. They had mistaken silence for weakness. Now they understood it was simply patience. And patience, when guided by clarity, can shift an entire household without a single raised voice. The next morning began with a different tone, subtle but undeniable. Daniel left early without lingering over coffee, and Ashley moved through the kitchen with a careful politeness that had not been there before. It was as if the walls themselves had shifted allegiance. I noticed that the cereal boxes were now lined up neatly along the back of the counter instead of spreading across it. Small adjustments. Quiet acknowledgements. I continued my physical therapy exercises in the living room, counting each stretch slowly, allowing the rhythm of movement to anchor me. When my granddaughter asked if I needed help reaching for the television remote, I smiled and told her I could manage. The truth was that I could manage many things. Around mid-morning, Daniel returned unexpectedly. He carried a stack of real estate brochures in his hand, glossy pages displaying townhouses and rental properties within 20 miles of the city. He placed them on the coffee table in front of me. We started looking, he said, his tone measured. It might take some time, but we are exploring options. I looked at the brochures without touching them. Images of open floor plans and staged kitchens stared back at me. That is wise, I replied calmly. Ashley stepped forward. We did not mean to make you feel displaced, she said. The word displaced hung between us like something fragile. I considered how easily that word could have become my reality if I had remained silent. Intent does not always determine impact, I answered gently. Daniel sat across from me, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, the way he used to when asking for permission as a teenager. Mom, we were worried, he said. You fell once last year. The surgery was serious. We thought being here would be better for everyone. I held his gaze steadily. Better for whom? I asked. He hesitated, then looked down at his hands. That hesitation told me more than any explanation could. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse. Instead, I reached for the remote and turned off the morning news, allowing silence to fill the space. I have updated my financial directives, I said evenly. Thomas Green will be assisting me with a formal review of all accounts and property documents. Ashley's posture stiffened slightly. Daniel looked up. Why? He asked. Because clarity prevents misunderstanding, I replied. And I prefer my intentions to be documented rather than assumed. The room grew still again, but this time the stillness felt deliberate rather than uncertain. I continued, I will also be installing a new lock system with individual access codes. It is simply practical. Daniel nodded slowly. If that makes you comfortable, he said. I noticed he did not argue. Later that afternoon, a technician arrived to assess the lock installation. Ashley watched from the hallway, her expression unreadable. I provided instructions calmly, choosing a code only I would know. As the technician worked, I reflected on how easily authority can shift when it is exercised without apology. That evening, Daniel approached me while I sat by the balcony doors. "We found a rental about 15 minutes away," he said. "It will be available in 3 weeks." 3 weeks. Less than the 30 days I had given them. I nodded once. "That sounds appropriate," I replied. He lingered for a moment, as if expecting something more, perhaps reassurance or regret. I offered neither. "Instead," I said, "I hope it provides the space you need." When he walked away, I felt neither bitterness nor triumph. Only steadiness. The household was already adjusting, recalibrating around boundaries that had finally been defined. They had entered believing proximity equaled permission. Now they understood that proximity without consent is simply intrusion. An intrusion, no matter how politely framed, cannot survive under clarity. 3 weeks passed more quickly than I expected, though each day carried its own quiet tension. Boxes began to appear near the hallway closet, neatly taped and labeled in Ashley's precise handwriting. The cereal containers disappeared from my pantry shelves one by one, and the pink comforter was folded and placed inside a large plastic storage bin. I watched these changes without comment, noting how different departure feels from arrival. When they moved in, everything had been swift and certain. Now every motion was measured, cautious, as though the air itself required permission. Daniel spent evenings reviewing rental agreements at the dining table, the same table where Thomas Green had once read aloud the phrases that shifted the balance back into my hands. I continued my physical therapy, walking slowly from the living room to the balcony and back, building strength one careful step at a time. The new lock system had been installed 2 days after our last conversation, and I noticed that Daniel hesitated slightly each time he entered the access code. It was a subtle reminder that access was no longer assumed. One afternoon, as I arranged fresh lilies on the console table, Ashley approached me with a small stack of mail. "We updated our forwarding address," she said. "Most of the bills are already redirected." I accepted the envelopes and nodded. "That is efficient," I replied. She lingered for a moment, her composure softer than before. "I did not realize you would take it this way," she admitted quietly. I studied her face, searching for defensiveness, but saw only a trace of reflection. "When a person returns home from surgery," I said evenly, "she expects familiarity, not relocation." Ashley lowered her eyes briefly. "We thought we were helping," she repeated. I allowed a gentle pause before answering. "Help that replaces is not help," I said. "It is substitution." She did not argue. The evening before their move, Daniel sat beside me on the balcony as the sun lowered over the river. The air carried the faint scent of rain, and traffic hummed distantly below. "I did not mean to overstep," he said after a long silence. His voice was quieter than I had heard it in weeks. I folded my hands in my lap. "Intent and action are different things," I replied. "You are my son. That does not change. But my independence is not negotiable." He nodded slowly, absorbing the words without resistance. "I understand," he said. The next morning, a rental truck idled outside the building. The children carried small backpacks and stuffed animals down the hallway, their footsteps lighter than the boxes the movers handled carefully. Ashley walked through each room one final time, checking drawers and shelves. Daniel paused near the dining table and looked at me as if waiting for something unspoken. I rose with my walker and extended my hand. He took it, squeezing gently. "Take care of yourself," he said. "I will," I answered. "You do the same." There were no raised voices, no dramatic exits. Only the steady rhythm of departure. When the door finally closed and the suite grew still, the silence felt different from before. It was not tense. It was restored. I walked slowly down the hallway to my bedroom and removed the storage bin containing the pink comforter. I placed it near the door, where it could be returned later if needed. Then I pulled fresh white sheets from my closet and remade the bed myself, smoothing each corner carefully. As I finished, I glanced around the room and noticed that Harold's photograph had been returned to its rightful place on the nightstand. The light from the window touched the frame gently. I sat at the edge of the bed and allowed a single steady breath to fill my lungs. They had entered believing proximity granted authority. They left understanding that authority remains where it has always belonged. And in the quiet that followed, I felt not loneliness, but ownership. The first morning alone felt unfamiliar, not because the space had changed, but because it had returned to its original shape. I woke before sunrise and listened carefully, half expecting the hum of the rental truck or the shuffle of children in the hallway, but there was only the soft whisper of the heating system and the distant sound of traffic along the river. I rose slowly, steady on my feet now without reaching immediately for the walker. The physical therapist had said progress would come in small increments, and she was right. Strength does not announce itself loudly. It simply appears one morning when you realize you no longer need to lean as heavily as before. I moved through the kitchen and brewed coffee exactly the way I liked it, 1 teaspoon of sugar and a measured splash of milk, watching the steam rise in the early light. The lilies on the console table stood tall and undisturbed. No sneakers by the door. No unfamiliar cereal boxes on the counter. I carried my mug to the balcony and stepped outside, resting my hands on the railing. The Hudson moved steadily below, unchanged by the temporary rearrangement of my household. I thought about the past month, about the hospital room and the folder placed before me while I was still groggy, about the pink comforter spread across my bed without permission. None of it felt dramatic now. It felt instructive. Later that morning, my phone rang. Daniel's name appeared on the screen. I answered calmly. He told me they were settling into the rental, that the commute would be longer but manageable, that the children liked their new rooms. I listened without interruption. "I hope you are comfortable," he said at the end of the call. I considered the word comfortable. "I am independent," I replied gently. There was a pause on the other end, and then he said he understood. After we hung up, I opened the folder Thomas had returned to me and placed it inside my desk drawer, this time closing it firmly. I had already met with him once more to update my estate plan, clarifying every detail in language that left no room for assumption. Not as punishment, but as protection. Clarity is not an act of hostility. It is an act of preservation. In the afternoon, I walked the length of the hallway without stopping, my steps slow but confident. I paused outside the second bedroom, now empty again, and allowed myself a small smile. The room would remain a guest space. A guest space implies invitation, not entitlement. As evening settled, I sat at the dining table where so much had unfolded over the past weeks. I traced my fingers lightly along the wood surface Harold once polished every Sunday afternoon. I realized then that the greatest shift had not been legal or logistical. It had been internal. I had returned from the hospital believing I was vulnerable because my body was healing. Instead, I discovered that awareness is stronger than assumption, and patience is stronger than panic. My family had mistaken my silence for surrender. They had mistaken my age for incapacity. They had mistaken proximity for permission. What they learned, and what I reaffirmed for myself, was simple. I survived surgery. I survived grief. And I will always survive the quiet attempts to rewrite my place in my own home. As the sun set beyond the river and the street settled into its rightful stillness, I felt not resentment, but certainty. This space is mine. My decisions are mine. And the door, now secured by a code known only to me, will open only when I choose.